Hey everybody, welcome to Origin Story, where we discuss the lives and careers of underrepresented groups and professional fields. Disclaimer, this chat represents our views and not those of our employers or affiliated organizations. Today I have Jesse Meza with me, someone who I've had a close relationship with first professionally and then personally. During a time like the COVID era, it's more important than ever for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to be able to gain a foothold. It's not easy. Jesse has overcome a lot of challenges to get where he's at today. But this isn't just about us. This is for you guys. So if you're finding yourself in a similar situation, needing help with school or finances, we're seeking to provide you some advice here from our learned experiences. And we'll have a Q&A at the end for that as well. And you'll see little bits and pieces throughout the conversation. So I'd like to start by reading through a recent letter of recommendation I wrote for Jesse, and this will give you some context into our relationship as well. This is for a fellowship program, and this is just one of many awards, scholarships that Jesse has pursued and gotten later on. So I'm going to jump into that. Here's an excerpt. Jesse and I met in 2016 through 212 NYC, New York's Interactive Advertising Club, a nonprofit organization for advertising professionals. I'd been working with the mentorship committee, and by fate or coincidence, I was assigned Jesse as my mentee. As with all the relationships, it took a bit to get moving, and once it did, Jesse and I were able to connect on so many things. I'd had a background on the ad agency side, so could relate to Jesse experiencing long work hours while trying to voraciously learn and about digital media and professional life. We mutually shared coming from a modest background and working our way up, albeit through different paths. That strengthened our professional relationship and friendship. My mother worked for various advocacy organizations such as Easter Seals, Head Start, and United Migrant Opportunity Services in Milwaukee. Well, first-generation families similar to Jesse's were in the set that she aided. I was also a Pell Grant recipient who attended school on scholarships. So it meant something very personal to me, to be able to uplift another young person after I benefited from the help of others. Suffice to say, in Jesse's case, it's not easy to be working, preparing for school, and trying to financially support his mother and her health while on the other side of the country. So with that gives you a little bit of introduction into our relationship. I'd like to pass it over to Jesse here to speak a little bit to his story. And this could be a very organic conversation, front to back. And you learn a lot about Jesse himself and how he got to be where he is right now. And, again, we're focusing on applied learning here as well. So, if you find yourself in a similar situation, we'd love to hear about it, especially when we get towards the Q&A. So, Jesse.
Thank you. That's a hell of an introduction. And thank you. I'm just so glad to be here, and I'm so glad to be able to share this space with you. I think we're going to get into some uncomfortable spaces today, and we're going to get into a few stories that I've gone through in my life. And I think a big part of why I wanted to share these stories, especially publicly, is because a big part of these stories where you're going through challenges, especially as a first generation person, you often end up feeling like you're being victimized by the system or by the place in which you are born into. And I really wanted to do this because I want to change that story. I want to change that story that's so often told to me and that sometimes I tell myself. And I want to change that to a narrative that I've faced certain challenges, I've gone through certain things, and they have helped me become who I am today. And I'm very grateful for who I am. They have helped develop me. And that's really why I wanted to do this with you, because I want to share that space and I want to share that learnings with whomever decides to join us or watch this video in the future. I hope you guys enjoy this. I hope it's a fun conversation, and I hope we all get to learn some fun stuff. So let's do it.
Great. So the first part I want to talk about here is your background. And, we've gotten a good amount of conversations in on this in the past, but, there's a lot here that I'm just hearing for the first time as well. So you had included a little bit here about your mom and, a bit of the background there. What is that story like?
Yeah, no, I'd love to get into it. So I guess whenever I introduce myself, I always, if there's a time to do so, I always like to talk about my mom a little bit because my story is so interconnected with hers. So my mom was born in Monterrey, Nuevo León. She was raised in Mexico and she came to the US in the early 80s. She came over here with her siblings on a visitor's visa. And she might have overstayed her visitor's visa a little bit. And my older brother was born in 87. I was born in 92. And my mom did absolutely everything she could for us. She raised us as best as she could. And her siblings and her friends, like they really helped her, like bringing me and my brother up. But as I got older, one of the things I definitely started to realize is there was a lot of small ways in which my mom was kind of shunned from the immigrant community because she did have two sons with two different men and she wasn't married to either one of them. So give you a little bit more context. I think when I was growing up, we had a lot of struggles, and one of the big ones was poverty. I remember when I think back now, I probably didn't realize how much poverty we were really facing, but it was definitely in the background. I remember like when I was in kindergarten, that every winter, I thought it was a fun activity. I thought me and my mom, my brother were all hanging out in the same room, but we would all hang out in the same room and we would all sleep together in the same bed. And the reason we did this every winter is because we never had a heater for a good number of years. So we would all sleep together and we would use all of our blankets together. And I remember growing up, I used to get lost in so many thrift stores because we spent so many countless hours in thrift stores looking for things. And I just had a lot of fun in them. But now that I look back, I realize why that was happening, why we were in that place in the first place. And I think one of the memories that really sticks out in my mind is I remember seeing one of my friends who lived next door. He was eating cereal with water. He was eating a bowl of cereal with water in it on the porch. And I asked my mom, like, why don't they have tacos like us? And she said two things that really stood out to me. She said, one, they don't make tacos at home, and two, they don't have milk. And that was when I discovered, oh shit, they're black and they have a different culture. And I also discovered there's a lot of people who are lacking a lot of things that they need. Now I didn't understand poverty, but I know as I got older and I saw more inequities in my community and around the people that were around me, it built a lot of empathy and compassion. I think we all have really basic human needs, and I think we should all have the accessibility to be able to meet them.
Yeah, those are all really good points there too. And it's like you find yourself in a given situation, and I think you highlight something important there, in that the rung of the ladder that you may find yourself on, it might feel at a certain place, but there's always somebody who might be in a worse situation than you, and that's something always, I think, to highlight. And you know I think I've seen the breadth of that. We both have, being in New York. I moved to New York from the Midwest, and it was a hugely shocking experience for, I think, anybody. It's a culture shock that way. You're moving to a different community and whatnot. But especially, when you're looking at something like that, like, I my family regularly received food stamps and Medicare and stuff like that. Well, I was going to school and we were growing up, and then, you know, maybe like the environment, when you get into a place like New York, where, there might be so much money, and, there's varying levels of that throughout the country, but there's always somebody that needs help, that more than you. And it's important to highlight that too. So, that's definitely seems like something to mitigate, and to humble yourself to. And I think that I've tried to do that more often in my professional life. And, you've done a lot of work with that recently as well. And, I speak to some more of it in that letter recommendation, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, programs like that. And I think that's so important. And it's so important to be vulnerable and to humble yourself as a professional.
100%.
So moving on to the next section here, imposter syndrome. And we were touching that on a little bit in the last section. But, there's this term gets brought up a lot, I think, now professionally. but it isn't necessarily always applied. And you get into a little bit of how do you adjust to that as you might be rising in more exclusive circles as you get out of school, as you become a professional, as the hierarchies and the opportunities eventually narrow. Some might disagree with that. There's other things you can do as you get older and whatnot, but there are different circles that you get introduced to throughout your career and your life. So what was that experience like for you?
I think I think the moment I stepped out of my zip code to go anywhere besides Mexico was definitely a culture shock. But I guess to speak more specifically about imposter syndrome, I think it's the way I go about managing the level of my imposter syndrome has changed over my life as I've gotten new experiences. Because I don't think it ever completely goes away, but you just learn how to deal with it better over time. Um, so when I was younger, kind of like when I first entered the industry, I feel like I code switched a lot, and it really made me feel like an outsider. So what I do now at my current age is I really use communication as a bridge. So I won't lie, I do code switch a bit, especially when I meet new people. And as we start to get more comfortable with each other, then I start to bring more of my personal background, more of my personality with cultural references, mannerisms, so that they can start to get comfortable with the level of diversity that I represent. And I guess to be more specific, the way I currently overcome imposter syndrome when I enter new circles is really through empathy. I remind myself that whoever I'm talking to is a human being just like me, and they're flawed just like me. And if they haven't learned to communicate with people outside their social circles, then they're probably living more stereotypes than whatever ones they're judging me by. So what I think in the back of my mind is, well, let me step out of my comfort zone and help this person understand that they can find value in relationships with people different from them. So I feel like I overcome imposter syndrome with compassion and empathy.
I think the compassion and empathy part is so important to that. And, it's hard when you feel like you're put in a position of, essentially being on the defensive. Um, and as mentioned in the last section, I definitely felt a good bit of that, coming from the background I did as well. And, it's interesting because, you're put in a position of, yes, humbling yourself to that, but you also might have to find ways to get other people to humble themselves to you. And I think as much as we might not want to, encourage things like code switching, there's some ways that it benefits you, like you mentioned there, and it's a deeper conversation as to how you bridge the gap, and maybe we can get a little bit into that into the Q&A. But yeah, just in terms of mannerisms, how your culture might differ from when you're coming into a new environment. There's a movie and book which many people on the chat have probably heard about, called Hillbilly Elegy, and it definitely is a very different kind of story, but it also deals with a lot of economic struggles and kind of puts that in the spotlight. And I think there's a bit of that people across the country go through to many extents. And there's a scene in the movie. This isn't too much of a spoiler. I recommend still watching the movie. But political perspective aside, the background on it is it's a true story of a young guy who grew up in small town Kentucky and Ohio, and he's struggling through poverty with addiction all around him, not himself, but others, to eventually become a lawyer at Yale, which is, when you talk about rags to riches stories, that's pretty impressive. And talks about how he was able to get where he got, regardless of the background that he came from. And there's a particular scene where he's at Yale and he attends this fancy dinner with all of these lawyers and law firms around, and he's completely uncomfortable. And when a waiter asks him about red or white wine, which is a question you get a lot in New York, especially when you're at happy hours and things like that, he doesn't know, and he asks for a white, and the waiter says Chardonnay or Pinot Grigio, and he's just kind of like, I don't know. and there's that kind of stuff that can sometimes become a difficulty. But I think if you stick to it and you confront those things over time, and you eventually do kind of blend into that, and you find ways to also raise your level of voice within that environment too, as you get more acclimated to it. So the next section here, you mentioned that your future success is not limited by your past failures. And this is an interesting scenario to get to as well. Again, when you talk about professional vulnerability, this is something big to offer. And, I'm impressed that, you're willing to talk about this kind of stuff too, but I also think it's important. And, I go by a phrase too, business is always personal. You might hear the opposite, but, like when you build connections with people, it's a connection, business aside. What was your experience like with that, and how does it relate back to that phrase?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think so the first story I really wanted to share here is kind of it was a pivotal moment in my life when I was younger, and I think it really helped shape my personal perspective, and it really helped me build eventually who I wanted to be as a professional. Um, so story number one. When I was 17, I was having a little bit of trouble deciding like who is it that I want to be. My friends weren't too interested in school, and I really wasn't either. My brother at this point, my older brother, had been in and out of jail a few times now, and I was kind of still dealing with that or figuring that out. And everyone around me kind of seemed to be ending up in the same similar kind of negative outcomes. So one day when I was walking home from summer school, there was a drunk driver, and he was just swerving around the street, and he actually swerved right by me, and it shook me a little bit because he swerved very close to me, and he just kept swerving down the street, and eventually about half a block down the street, the guy just parks halfway into the ditch. He kind of just crashed into the ditch, and he stumbles out of the car, and this guy just reeks of alcohol, and he stares at me as he's walking away from the car, and he like halfway stumbles away, and he just continues walking down the street and leaves his car in there with the keys in and the ignition in and the doors are open,
Wow.
and just throw up in the passenger seat. And I remember looking in, first thing I thought was I've dealt with alcoholism in my life, and I don't necessarily want this person to lose their entire vehicle. So the first thing I did was I took the keys out the ignition and I just dropped them in the car. Second thing I did, because I was 17 years old and I was a pretty heavy smoker at that point, I saw a pack of cigarettes and I took the cigarettes. So I took about 10 steps away from the car, and three cop cars surrounded me. And in an instant, I realized exactly what had just happened. One of the cop cars put on the loudspeaker and they're like, "You can slowly start to approach our vehicle." So the drunk guy in the car were all a setup, and it was a bait operation ran by the Houston Police Department.
Oh, wow.
So as soon as they took me down to booking and they started processing me in city jail, I felt like my world just kept getting smaller and smaller. And I was thinking about my friends, my family, my mom, and I just felt like I failed everyone. And I really felt like I hadn't really taken the thought to figure out who I was, and I just conformed to what I was seeing. It made me feel like a living, breathing statistic, to be honest. And to be honest, it really pissed me off. And
Right.
it made me feel like there's something else that I want to do with my life. And I don't know what that something else was, but I was ready to do everything I could do within my power to make a new life. So when I started my senior year in high school later that year, I asked everyone I could for help with college application essays, financial essays, figuring out schools, learning what GPA stood for, because I had no idea what the hell that thing stood for. And there was just so many people that helped me. And I think one of the lines I ended up writing in my application essay to University of Texas was, I refuse to be a product of my environment when I can make my environment the product of my actions. And that's how I decided to start living my life. And that's what I really wanted the viewers of here today to know and take away from this story is that whatever your future endeavors are, whatever your goals are, your success is never limited by your past failures. Because I feel like we often get dragged down by our mistakes, or when relationships end, or companies don't promote us or even hire us. And that's often the first thought I hear from a lot of people when they start considering future goals, or like, what are we going to do in 2021? The first thing a lot of people start to think about is the last thing that they failed. And if I kept thinking about my future in terms of my arrest, in terms of the system setting me up, in terms of being an outsider in this society, I would have never dreamed bigger than that lifestyle. So what I really wanted to take away from this story to be is, whatever your mistakes are or your challenges have been, I promise 2021 is a new year, and you can build a new you, however it is you want your new you to look like, because there's new opportunities out there that we don't have to keep reliving our past.
Sure. And, obviously this could be a loaded subject too. But, like, I think you raise a good point there. And, there's a lot of it that you have to mentally put behind you. But at the same time, there's a systemic thing there as well, where, you want to, where you can, build advocacy and have other voices that, you can lean on that way. And so, like, I grew up in Milwaukee under, like, during the time when David Clark's police department was running the city, and that was real interesting. And there's just ways that it seems you have to push back. I have friends that basically became victims to that too, and it sounds like, for what you're mentioning there, it was almost kind of set up like a trap, and that kind of speaks to itself. But I think when you come into the professional world and there's things that happen in your environment that might show up on a background check or your resume or whatnot, like, having voices within the company to advocate for you, I think goes a huge way. And I think you've already exemplified some of that with, the diversity committees that you've helped found, and things of that nature. And I think, myself, I've tried to seek similar advocacy that way. Is, if you find somebody that shares your story, latch on to them, stay in touch, see where it goes, because, you're going to be working your professional life 40, 50, maybe 60 years, and people pop up different places. And, most of the time people are usually willing to give you a helping hand, and they know that it'll be reciprocated. So next section here, we talk a little bit about your move into your career. And you mentioned that your community is your bridge to opportunities, and basically how you got into advertising itself. And I think this is a pretty interesting story because there's not as many people who major in advertising. I happen to minor in that, but like, there's people that come from all sorts of different industries into it. But how did you get to that path, and what's your story behind that?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, so being that I'm a first generation person, first generation graduate from high school, going to college, and everything that comes thereafter. One of the things that I knew when I got into college, I was like, I want to have a dope job. Like, I want to do something cool, and I want to make money and take care of my family and be able to do cool things like travel the world or whatever. So originally I was thinking about finance, and I realized when I was 18 years old, I realized, finance, I am not ready to adapt to the mannerisms of finance. So I started looking around, and I found advertising. I was like, whoa, like, this is kind of quirky. This is kind of creative. I can still kind of be myself and still talk about numbers and try to build a career here. So I knew I wanted to do advertising, but as you and me both know, advertising encompasses a whole lot of jobs. And the fall of my junior year, I ended up taking media planning, which is the first media planning course that I'd ever taken. And I just fell in love with it. We had an amazing professor, Professor Tobias at UT. She's just amazing. She really, really broke it down, and she taught me the psychology and the math behind it. So by the end of that course, I knew this was what I wanted to do. I went in on the presentations, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And this was the very first 101 course that allows you to apply to the media planning track at UT, which is a certification, which was an amazing pipeline to a career in media planning. So I was really hyped up. I was really juiced, and I was like, I'm gonna do this. And Professor Tobias rejected me. Apparently, I didn't really do that well in class, and I was like, oh shit. Um, so what am I supposed to do now?
Right.
And that was the end of my fall. That was the end of fall my junior year, and I kind of took the winter break to just think about like what is going to happen now. So by the time I started spring my junior year, about a month later, that January, I said, I really decided I'm gonna start my media plan. I'm gonna start my career in media planning with or without UT. I'm gonna just make that happen however I need to make that happen. So I was part of the Texas Advertising Group, which is a student group that helps people get into the ad industry. And every spring break, they would take this trip to New York. They would take a bunch of students to New York and just tour them around different media and creative agencies so that they could start building out their networks and like you can learn what it is you need to learn to get into these places. So I was really excited. I was really hyped up. I'm like, yes, we're gonna go on this spring trip. This is my retribution. This is how I get into the industry now. And about a week out from that spring break trip to New York, the whole thing got canceled. And I was like, damn it, I really wanted to work in this. It got canceled, and I remember my significant other at the time, my partner at the time, she texted me right before my finance midterm at that point, and it must have been about 10 minutes before my midterm. And before I started my midterm, I replied to her and I told her, I already bought the flight. I'm going. Like I with or without the school, I'm going because this is what I want to work in. So I took my midterm, and then the rest of the day, I just skipped all my classes, and I was like, I'm gonna figure out how to go. So I reached out to all the other students that had been accepted to the program. I was like, who else is still down to go and make this happen? I reached out to them. A few of them got back to me. I reached out to my fraternity brothers, and I was like, who can let me sleep on their couch or their floor, wherever I need to sleep when I get to New York? I reached out to UT alumni. I was like, who can introduce me to people in ad agencies? And then I finally reached out to my professors whose classes I had just skipped. And I was like, can you please connect me to alumni because I'm going to New York and I want to meet advertising people because I want to work in media planning. And ultimately what ended up happening is there was about 4 of us that went. We still went without the school and we had an amazing time. We built really great friendships and we had so much support from so many different people that we never would have expected. I told my professors about this story after we came back that spring. And Professor Tobias, the one who had originally rejected me, she told me, you should reapply to the media certification program. So I did. And she finally accepted me. So I started that my senior year, and that was really my path into the ad industry, and it ended up working out. And that's how I ended up going into media planning. So what I really learned from this experience is your community, whatever community you invest and build in, that's really going to be the bridge to your opportunities. So I was pretty stubborn and bold and unwilling to miss out on the $200 I had dropped on that flight. So that was on me, but there's no way that this trip would have been successful without the help of all these different people. So what I really wanted all the viewers to get to know from this story is that whatever it is you're doing or wherever you are in your life, you really should be investing in your friends and your personal and your professional network and your family, because when the time comes up, these are really going to be the people that save you and that help you in whatever you're going through. So take some time, not just during the holidays and Christmas and January, just take some time regularly to check in on those relationships and invest in them.
Absolutely. So now's the time, everybody. We're about to head into the holiday break. Yeah, that's interesting. You tell a bit of that story too. And just in general, Houston being, one of the larger cities in the country, did you feel like you found your network there, to be as valuable as somebody who, say, went to school at, a top tier university, Ivy Leagues, or one that's in a bigger city like New York, LA, et cetera. How has that helped you?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I definitely have networks in different cities and different socioeconomic circles, and I feel like they're also valuable in different ways. Our last time I went home, well, it wasn't last time, this was a few years ago actually. I went home and I was in Houston and I hit up one of my friends and I was like, yo, I need a ride. Can you pick me up from the airport and take me home? And he was like, yeah, we're going to make a stop along the way. And I said, okay, cool. And the stop along the way, we actually stopped at another friend's house who was moving from his apartment to another apartment. And we helped him move the couch. So while I just landed in Houston, we helped him move some furniture before I ever even got to my house. And then he was like, oh shit, my new apartment actually has an AC built in. So he was like, I got this extra AC. And he was like, hey, Jesse, you want this AC? And I was like, yes, I do. Because that could really help my mom because I know she had a broken AC. Now I feel like there's these different networks that help you in different ways that you don't ever really potentially plan for. But just investing in them and keeping them alive is so helpful. Like the other person you mentioned, the Yale person or the college person, they're dope. They might give you that opportunity to the door at a company, but there's other networks outside of that that might be more helpful personally.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring into the conversation that there's other networks outside of that, and um, we find ourselves in an interesting time too with COVID and whatnot. What tools are you using to network right now, knowing that people can't really meet up in person? There's a bunch of lockdowns going into place. You might have to do it more virtually, and has stuff like that been effective now that you're outside of college, and you might not have the alumni network there, and you have to build that up.
Yeah, I think it's been different. I think a lot of new people that I meet, especially because I'm in school right now and the MBA program is through Zoom. But as far as kind of taking a step back and investing in other networks that I'm already a part of, like friendships or family, it might sound funny, but I actually make more phone calls now than I've ever made in my life. Like a phone call goes such a long way. A lot of people are tired of Zoom. I'm tired of Zoom. But it's like just take the time, do a 10-minute phone call with somebody, and it goes a long way. And just check in on how they're doing and let them know that
Absolutely.
you're thinking of them.
Yeah, that's a great point too, and I think that I myself have found myself victim to this too. You get so much in this routine of who you interface with on a daily basis during the pandemic that you might not be reaching out to friends that you've known for years, and you lose touch that way just because you have to take the time out of your day to make a phone call. um, and it's important, especially call your mom, call your dad during Christmas, uh, Hanukkah, whatnot, New Year's. Like that's something that I've yet had to remind myself to do. So yeah, it's easy to lose track of that kind of stuff, and that those phone calls seem to be very valuable, especially during the pandemic when there's so much Zoom overkill. Great. So moving on to the next topic here, and I should mention that for anybody who has questions so far, please feel free to ask them in the chat. We'll start to preload those, and we will definitely get to it towards the Q&A. And I know we've already had people like Rebecca excited that we're talking about media planning. So the next topic is forgiveness is freeing. And I think this one might be a little bit heavy as well, but it's important, again, like we said, to be humble and to be vulnerable as a professional. So riffing off of that, Jesse, tell us a little bit about that concept, what it means to you, and what the story is behind it.
Yeah, no, it's a great segue. Forgiveness is freeing. And I think this topic's actually going to really go into what Elvira asked here about self-care. So yeah, this one's a bit more personal, but I will do my best to tell this story. So as a first generation person who's graduated from high school, graduated from my undergrad, gone on to a career and won a few things, gone on to an MBA program. One of the things that I face a lot is just a huge amount of survivor's guilt, especially with my family and some of my friends. And what that means is sometimes, honestly, I do feel guilty, especially when I spend more time investing in myself and I'm not like helping others or giving back in one way or another. So after I graduated from UT in 2015, I moved to New York City. And in 2019, I moved to LA. And I thought to myself, like, I'm in a really good place in my career. I'm in a really good place in my life. Um, my brother's been struggling for a while. He's been struggling very deeply for a while, but I'm in a good place. Let me take some time to help him. So my brother moved in with me in fall of 2019, and he lived with me for a year. And I think that was one of the hardest years that I've ever had in my life. Um, Living with a family member that's an alcoholic is just a mental and emotional struggle, just day after day. I think the anger and the tears and the laughter and the glimpses of hope, it's a never-ending roller coaster, and I wasn't prepared for it. That I never struggled with anything like that. I don't think school was ever that hard. I don't think my career was ever that hard. I don't think studying was ever that hard. But what I ended up realizing was like I couldn't help him, and no matter what I did, I couldn't change someone who didn't want to change, and that's a hard realization, especially with a family member. So after living together for a year, we decided that neither one of us was really doing that well living together. And as much as we love and care about each other, we're just two guys living two different kinds of lives. So he moved back to Houston, and he's currently working in construction. He's still managing his life. And I guess what I really wanted to speak about was that year that we were together. It really pushed me to a certain level of pessimism and anger and depression that I hadn't really visited in a long time. And I'm back in therapy now, and I'm back in support groups for family members of alcoholics. And what therapy has really helped me realize is that the things that happened, the emotions that came from them, it wasn't his fault, and it's not my fault either. More specifically, what I learned in therapy is forgiveness. I We went through a lot, and I went through a lot, and I forgive him. I forgive him for those long nights of dread. I forgive him for the confusion. I forgive him for all the shitty situations. I forgive him from the bottom of my heart, and that is so liberating. Um, I forgive him not because I think he's sorry. I don't actually know if he's sorry. He probably is at some level, but I forgive him more importantly because I know carrying that burden of anger and mistrust and paranoia, it only harms me, and it only harms the future relationship that I'm trying to build. So what I really want everyone here to know is that in order to really move past any trauma, you have to learn a certain level of forgiveness, and that's not easy, and it doesn't come quickly. But when you're ready to move past certain things, I think forgiveness really is the path to freedom.
Yeah, I really feel that, and I think it's so difficult to have family members that are in that situation because you feel like your hands are tied a little bit, and that is sometimes feel powerless because you feel like they're going to just do what they're going to do regardless of how you intervene. And there's an emotional hurt that is involved with that. And you try everything you can to benefit that person. I know in past sessions of this, I've talked about my relationship with my father and what that means for just you know pre prelude to where you go in the future. And if you have things like that are coming into your personal life, it's hard to build past it. But forgiveness is so important. And when you look at essentially what's where that person finds themselves, maybe later on, maybe they mellow out a little bit as they get older. um, you don't necessarily forget those things, and you carry them with you. But there is a degree of moving forward from it, and then I think that that's not easy, and it's very admirable that um, you've done that work to you know rise from that and learn from that experience. And I think that that's really big in and of itself. And so bridging that topic to, you know, when you're coming out of that environment and you have all of these family disruptions, which, I'm sure people are experiencing even more of these during COVID with, people all living in one unit or, those type of situations. Um, do you feel like it's a burden a bit to, your future success, or do you feel like um, you kind of are able to put it aside a little bit? And what are some tactics you've used to deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things I just want to touch on really quick because you mentioned that you feel like it's a burden. And I think one of the things that overall theme across these stories that I'm sharing today, and I'll try to sum up towards the end later, is these burdens and challenges are really based on your perspective. And these, once you create your perspective on what's happening to you, you can decide what you want to do about it. But more specifically, to answer your question about the tactics to take care of yourself, um, I think I really do. I try to create space. I think everybody should try to create space for wherever they are, and that can mean physical space or mental space. It can mean you go hang out in the garage, you go hang out in the car, you take longer showers, wherever it is. Just find some time to breathe. One of the biggest challenges that I found when I was raised in poverty is the goal is always just get past what's in front of you. There's another bill, there's another broken car, there's another flat tire, a speeding ticket, something at school, some test at work. I don't know. There's just always some other situation right in front of you. But what you really have to do to get past this is make room for you to breathe. And when you're ready, start to seek therapy and other forms of support groups to help you start forming a new space in your mind, a new space that gets rid of that old space and creates space for the new person, the new emotional patterns you want to build within yourself. Because when you're in an unstable home or family environment, you mentioned this too. You often get stuck in that emotional state, even when you're away from it. Like you step away from it, but you still in the back of your mind thinking like, "Damn, I still got to go back." Or you're still angry about what happened or about what someone said, or you're still feeling some way. And what you really need to do is create space to process what happened and then create space to take care of yourself. And it doesn't have to always be a big thing. It can start with small indulgences. And then you just build from there and you just keep building from there and you start to create positive habits.
That's some really great advice too. And yeah, I think there's a certain anger that you can sometimes associate with something like that when you might look at other people, in other communities or scenarios and whatnot, and say, how have I found myself here? And I can even think, when like you look at it in a degree of normalcy, but you realize nothing's normal, and you're like, why did I have to put a auto title lien on my car just to pay off bills? And that's something that happened to me. I'm like, this is my story and I'm going to own this, you know? And I think there's a certain courage that comes with that as well. And, everything you said there. So thank you very much for, everything you provide there. And another organization I want to call out here, and again, we want to make this actionable for you guys, is one that worked with in the past. It's called Defy Ventures. And this is going back a topic or two. But this is an organization that I've worked with where essentially you have formerly incarcerated people and they'll get together for a session as they're building a business. They're actually in the process of building a business and becoming entrepreneurs. And you'll sit down with them and give them advice and just walk through the business plans that they've made. The organization helps with that. But their whole thing is getting outside advice from people that's valuable as they kind of walk that path and kind of build a new life for themselves. So Defy Ventures, check it out. We might shout out some other organizations towards the end of the conversation, but I thought this was an important one to throw in there. All right. And then we maybe have just a couple topics left here. And so moving on here, mitigating distractions. And we talked a little bit about that. So it's good we're touching on that too. How do you mitigate an unstable home and family environment? So, for that topic in itself, you're getting phone calls in the middle of the day from a relative, or, you have to jump out of school or work to handle different scenarios. What does that look like when you're still pressing hard to kind of, work out of the environment that you're in?
Yeah, I think I guess it kind of grows on the last thing that I was talking about, creating that space for you. I think one of the big things for me when I try to create space for myself and my mental health is really, really heavily working out and just going more into working out, going more into education, and just spending more time. And by education, I mean reading. I don't necessarily mean school. I just mean reading, because I think many times reading is a lot more important than school. Um, just making time for the things that you like and the things that you do, to just invest in yourself and your body and your mind and yourself emotionally, and just starting to do those things repeatedly. And it's kind of like usually what ends up happening, especially when you're in an unstable home or environment, is you get used to like always being in this negative headspace. You gotta try to kind of break out of that. And you do that by starting to work out more often, by starting off your day a certain way, by ending your day a certain way. And especially when it's so busy, like, yeah, the phone calls, they come in, the Zoom calls, the meetings, all these things going on, all this stuff in the news about COVID, and all these crazy just news headlines. And every single one of them is trying to be bigger than the last one because they want to get your attention. What you really have to do is just take 5 minutes, 10 minutes in your regular daily routine and build just a small certain period of time to invest in yourself and like reinvest in aligning your thoughts and your mind.
I think that's a really good point too there. And coming off of that topic as well, you use the phrase blissipline, which I like. And that's the first time I've heard it used, but I think it really applies to this too. So when you look at overcoming anxiety, depression, and all of the things that oftentimes those situational circumstances present to you, like how do you overtake that, and how do you put it behind you, and also maybe how do you absorb it in a way that you're not just necessarily like shoving it under the carpet?
That's a hell of a segue. That was a great way to go, Adam.
Thanks.
uh, no, thank you for creating this space. But I guess to speak more specifically, there is one topic that I tried to shape my life around, and that's called discipline. So I shared a few stories here today, but there's just so many, many more, and so many other things that aren't mentioned or that we are able to mention in a 1 hour call. And I think there's a lot of things that happen in our lives that can easily start to make any of us, like constantly start to feel anxious about certain things, or constantly fall into reoccurring pits of depression, or just other challenges. I know some things that I've struggled with personally is not always being great at opening up, or being really stubborn, or sometimes stereotyping people that are different from me. And I think all of these negative things, they all really start with thought patterns. So it was really easy for me, I think for most of us, to see what our shortcomings are, but it's a little bit harder trying to figure out like what it is you need to do in order to get past this. So this is another story, story time. So about 6 months ago, I read this book called Miracle Morning, and it really provided me with a general structure that I really needed to move past a lot of what I felt my shortcomings are. And it's really simple. You just really start to change your habits, and you start to build patterns that allow you to work on your struggles while you're building your skills to get through to whatever is next. So after I read this book, what I really started to do is I usually wake up around 5:15 every morning. With school over the last month or two, I probably pushed that back to about 6 in the morning. And every morning I spend about 60 to 90 minutes either working out, journaling, meditating, reading, doing yoga, or reviewing my life goals. And it's just this hell of an amazing feeling. Like my body's in the best shape I've ever been in. I'm in the best state of mind I've ever been in. And all it really need to do is just start to take the time to create this mental and emotional space. So usually the first thing I do when I wake up every morning is I start to build a feeling of gratitude and just think about what I'm thankful for before I step out of bed. And then the second thing that really comes into play is as soon as I turn on my computer, the first thing I see is the 20-year life plan that I have on my computer monitor, because I know where it is I want to go. I definitely know where I started, but now I know where it is I'm trying to go. So I constantly do these routines, and I constantly do them because I want to get more out of what I'm doing. And funny enough, this actually reminds me of a side story. So this is somebody else's story. So what I refer to this as is called sharpening the saw. And I don't know if everybody's heard about sharpening the saw. So there's this story about a man who's cutting down a tree with a saw, and he's really tired and he's getting really just exhausted from cutting the saw. So someone else passes by and they're like, "Hey, you look tired." And he's like, "Yeah, I'm trying to cut down this tree." And they tell him, "Maybe you should take a moment to try to sharpen the saw. Like that's a very dull saw you're trying to cut this big tree down with." And the guy says, I can't take a moment to sharpen the saw. I got to finish cutting the tree. And it's this idea of like, you need to sharpen your tools and you need to sharpen your mind to get to your goal. It's kind of like saying you're on a road trip and you don't want to stop for gas because you got to finish the road trip. Like, you got to take a time to take a step back and then reinvest in yourself and reinvest in the tools that you're using. So the main takeaway that I've gotten from this whole process is that you really need to build routines, and that creates discipline. It creates bliss through discipline. Um, so these are these little habits of time that you use to self-assess yourself and decide which patterns you really want to build into your life so that you can build your life into whatever it is you want it to become in the future. So regardless of where you are in your life or whatever phase of life you're in, the more you invest in yourself, the more you can get out of your current circumstances and be better prepared for whatever's going to come next your way. Because if there's one thing I think we all know is there's always going to be something else coming your way. There's always another problem. There's always another challenge. There's always something else. And the better prepared we are for it, the better we'll be able to overcome it.
That's fantastic. And this is actually bringing to mind too, in the past, we've done the military veteran sessions with my friends Don and Niles. And there's a podcast out there by this guy named Jocko Willink. And he tends to do training sessions with even in digital media companies and things like that. And he's an ex-Navy SEAL. So that's an unlikely place for this to be echoed. But, you know, one of the phrases that he uses a lot is strength through discipline, and discipline is strength and things like that. And I think that, you know, that's a universal truth, both in life and leadership, that you have to look at. And thank you, Marisol, for joining so much, and also for your comments. And we're going to have a recording after the video here that you'll see, and we're going to answer maybe some of your questions too when we get into the Q&A here. But yeah, just to restate here, we're probably going to close out and go to Q&A. But I think that, you know, what we worked through here, there's some really nice truths that have come out of this. And, you know, a couple of those that's coming to mind, seek advocacy when and where you can get it through your network, you know, and you might meet somebody right now that is a connection that is going to be valuable years down the road. And, you know, you make new connections all the time, and that there's ways that you can do that even in a digital environment that are meaningful. Also, that you need to own your situation, and you need to look at, you know, the past and, you know, apply that to the future. And that, you know, that in itself is a big strength. And then also that, you know, your past doesn't necessarily dictate your future. So even though you might be in an uncomfortable environment, to stick it out, to be headstrong, and to always be at least humble enough to, you know, come to a middle ground where you can have your perspective, you can see other people's perspectives, but you can still know, I am the person that I am, they're the person that they are, and here's where we can maybe connect. And I think that that takes a lot to overcome as well. So those were, I guess, my three big takeaways from it. And then towards the end here, Jesse, I know you maybe had a final piece of advice to live a life of passion and purpose. You know, what's your take on that?
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, I think I just wanted to add a closing statement to all these stories, and I think the general theme across them is I honestly think the most important voice you're ever going to hear in your life is the one between your ears, and you really have to spend the time to train that voice to sound like the person you want to be, or to sound like the person who's able to live the life you want to create, whenever that is, or whatever that looks like. So my final piece of advice would really train your mind to sound like the narrative you want it to be, because you are the author, editor, and publisher of your own life.
Love it. So yeah, we'll break to Q&A here, and I'm going to answer some questions here from the audience. One's to Caroline. what makes a good ally in your eyes?
That's a great question. Um, I think there's different ways of being an ally, and there's more forefront, more more uh, more ways of being an ally. There's ways of being an ally where you're very straightforward, and there's ways of being an ally where you're a little bit more behind scenes. So what I mean by being straightforward is maybe when you're in a room with someone whose voice isn't as amplified as usually, or someone who is often talked over in meetings or certain spaces, like just jump in the meeting and say like, hey, did you want to say something, or you want to add something to that, or you look like you have some thoughts on this. The second way, which I mean, which is a little bit more in the background, is you use your influence to speak on behalf of someone when they're not in the room, or to speak to somebody higher up, because you know, like this person is a little bit on the younger side, or this person doesn't typically look like someone who's usually in these rooms. So they might not be given as much of an attention as someone like you who wants to be an ally and has more influence over higher up management might be able to do. So I would say either way, whatever you're more comfortable with, um, just do whatever you can, wherever you can.
Yeah, that's great advice there too. And then had a shout out from Jesus here. Thanks for sharing, brother. What was the name of the book you mentioned?
Oh, Miracle Morning. Dope book, really dope book.
Awesome. Miracle Morning. Um, and then you had a couple other books that we talked about here. Um, Between the World and Me by ta-Nehisi Coates, Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. The last two, which I've definitely read, the third, which I probably need to get into. So those are good shout outs too. Definitely always good to add things to the reading list. And then I'll cover another question here. This one is from Marisol. Many of the institutions, higher education and corporations were not made for people of color. Do you see your presence in these spaces as a form of resistance and empowerment for our communities?
Oh, 1000%. Shit. I know one of the things that's come up a lot is all the protests and social unrest that we have going on this year throughout in our country. Now, one of the things that came up with some of my friends in the smaller circle when we were talking about this earlier this year is like those of us who are women and people of color that are going into these rooms like day in and day out, our lives are a form of protest. Like every single time we step into these rooms and we show that we are valued and that we can bring a certain voice to these rooms and bring a certain perspective that's valued and creates dope stuff inside of these places where we haven't traditionally been accepted, we are empowering not only ourselves, we're empowering our communities, we're empowering the people who come after us and look like us. So 1000% agree with that.
Love it. And then I'm going to pass the mic here. So are there any other people here that have questions that you might want to throw out? Please feel free to ask them in the chat. I will unmute you. It looks like Elvira might not still be here, but she'd asked the question here, going back to this. How have you been able to practice self-care during this time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I kind of got into it a little bit towards the end with the last topic I touched on, but I think self-care needs to be built into the lifestyle. Otherwise, it becomes kind of like people that say, "Oh, I want to lose 20 pounds and get to this different weight by like summer or something." But the thing is, you shouldn't necessarily really be trying to lose 20 pounds. You should have already been 20 pounds lighter and should have been at that weight, and you stay at that weight. Otherwise, you're constantly just going back and forth of trying to improve your wrongs. And it's like, well, why not just cut the wrong out in the first place and just eat healthier, period? Like, just eat more salads or whatever, or spend more time working out or do whatever it is you need to do. But I think self-care really needs to be something that you build into your life every single day. Otherwise, it's really easy to get caught up in things that happen in our lives.
Of course, and everything in moderation.
Yeah.
that's also seems to be a universal truth. Actually, a question from me here too, and this might be useful to some people in the audience. So you're doing an MBA program right now virtually. Do you show up on campus at all?
Oh no, it's amazing. I get to do this MBA program from Zoom, and I know it's not exactly the experience a lot of people want from an MBA program, but I really appreciate it. Um, at least during this first year, because I think the second year will be in person. During this first year, we're doing the MBA program completely on Zoom, and it's hella nice because I get to wake up and like I just turn on the internet and I'm in class now. Like I don't have to leave my space, or I don't have to not be able to work out or not be able to build my own routines or do whatever it is I want to do. Like it just makes my time so much more flexible. So I really enjoyed it.
Love it. Yeah, and I think that we talked in the discovery session a little bit earlier about, one of the big things that people are confronting during the pandemic, especially, parents, kids, is the return to school. And, we'll see where that goes with the new lockdown restrictions and whatnot. But there's been these news reports of, an outsized effect where you have Black and Latino communities out there that are affected in an outsized way by the return to school, and maybe they're not getting the kind of attention that they would be. Also, I've had friends that say, like, my kid finds it hard to concentrate even at home uh, doing this kind of stuff when he's got all these things going on around him. So for something like that, do you feel like you're seeing the effects of that? And do you feel like you've experienced that at all doing virtual learning?
Yeah, I think the it's hard. I think yeah, that's a really hard topic. Like there's a lot of people who have unequal access to internet or computers or to teachers, and it's this whole COVID thing has really highlighted how different certain people's lifestyles are and how different their access to resources are. And that is a very sad truth. Um, at least for me personally, it's I think it's been a very big challenge for my family in Texas and in Mexico. They're really dealing with some inequities and some stuff that's really much a result of not having access to resources. For me personally, I feel like living here in LA, I feel extremely blessed to be able to have this Wi-Fi and this internet connection. I honestly don't have much outside of this apartment, but I do feel like I have everything I need within it.
Yeah, that's something interesting to highlight too. I mean, I even have seen within my company, within advertising, I guess we talk less about media planning and advertising than I expected we would, but I think that that's also meaningful, and there's a reason for that. Um, but yeah, people have issues with their internet, and um, that like hopefully in the future uh, there will be some kind of subsidy for that type of thing, for kids going to school, because there seems to be no end in sight for this. But having those like individual resources seems to be pretty difficult. So on a broader kind of macro level, hopefully, there can be some sort of bill passed to get funding for that sort of stuff, especially for kids that are going to public school. Well, I went to public school for the longest time, and it's just like, you don't necessarily get the resources that you need. My mother was a teacher; she had to buy her own school supplies, even when we were, in the financial situation we were. So that seems to be very important as well, in helping to bridge that gap. It's a really interesting topic to touch on too. Um, Great. Well, yeah, I think this might be a good place to close it out. Looks like there might not be any Q&A, but I will pause for just maybe 30 seconds for anybody else that might have something else. Jeopardy timer starts now. All right, great. Well, any closing statement?
Closing statement. I think this has been a really challenging year. And I think what I really want people to get out of some of the stories that I shared today is that there's a lot of years that can be really shitty, and there's a lot of situations that can be really shitty, but you can always take it upon yourself to at least try to make your own individual experience a little bit better and try to keep working on yourself. So
Right.
I just wish everyone a whole lot of self-care next year and every year after that.
Yeah, I'm going to do one last question as the caboose from Daniela. Who inspires you?
Oh, that's a good question. Shit. I would say Sandra Cisneros. I love reading her books and I love reading everything she writes. Like she's just a dope writer and she helps me gain perspective. Yeah. So I think she definitely inspires me.
Love it. All right. Well, thanks everybody. There'll be a recording after the session. We'll send that out to everyone and really appreciate you all joining. I think these are topics that we talked about today that really don't get discussed enough, and hoping to, you know, cover these in a future session and maybe have Jesse on for another chat as well. Enjoy your weekend, everybody.